So this is a very special and unique audience here. And I'm going to direct this particular talk to the psychedelic community. There's about 6 or 7 different versions of this I do, covering different versions of history, different periods, different themes. This one's very specific. As you can see, consciousness and revolution, what the hell happened to the psychedelic movement, and are we going to fix it? Okay. So just as now by the way, this is my first PowerPoint. Never actually done one of these before. Pretty neat. Whipped it together in like 5 minutes last night. Okay. The Americans must start with self-promotion, so I'm going to put my own quote up first. All revolutions begin as revolutions of consciousness. I think it was also David Nutt who said yesterday, Einstein's quote, you cannot solve a problem using the same level of consciousness that created it. Keep that in mind as well. Okay. You guys may remember this gentleman. The history of the world is the history of revolution, Che Guevara. So what does that mean? The history of the world is the history of revolution. Well, this guy right here, Orwell, he was pretty eloquent, and he had a really good way of putting it, so I'm going to read you now. And this is from the Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, which is the book within a book inside George Orwell's 1984. It's about the high, the middle, and the low. Throughout recorded times, and possibly since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been 3 kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers, as well as their relative attitude towards one another, have varied from age to age, but the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however, for it is pushed one way or the other. The aims of these 3 groups are entirely irreconcilable. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the low that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men will be equal. Thus, throughout history, a struggle which is the same in its main outlines recurs over and over again. For long periods, the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later, there always comes a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern effectively, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective, the middle thrust the low back into their old position of servitude and themselves become the high. Presently, a new middle group splits off from one of the other groups or from both of them, and the struggle begins all over again. Of the 3 groups, only the low are never even temporarily successful in achieving their aims. It would be an exaggeration to say that throughout history there has been no progress of a material kind. Even today, in a period of decline, the average human being is physically better off than he was a few centuries ago. But no advance in wealth, no softening of manners, no reform or revolution has ever brought human equality a millimeter nearer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much more than a change in the name of their masters. Thank you, George. So, the whole reason that we're sitting here today is that about 50 years ago there was this revolution called consciousness revolution. It was a 20-year period, and these were the main tenets: psychedelic, sexual liberation, alternative spirituality, political engagement and organizing, protest, the loss or corruption of the sacred cows of science, religion, and government. Drugs, the counterculture, and consciousness undermine faith in hierarchical religious authority and political authority, hence the 60s rebellions. However, what happened? Well, The movement kind of split. It bifurcated into hard science and pseudoscientific New Age. It went in two different directions, and never the twain have met since. As the science has steadily progressed, psychedelic culture has steadily regressed. And I make that assertion as candidly as I possibly can. The embracing of pseudoscience and pseudohistory and mysticism and all these things have their place, but they have actually replaced science for many people in this movement. So when people like Ben Sessa or Dave Nichols say that the hippies are a liability to psychedelic progress, this is a little bit of what they're talking about. A little bit of how the culture hasn't advanced in the same way, except in one category, which we can talk about, which is spiritual progress. We have learned a lot in these 50 years. We have evolved a lot in these 50 years. We've gained new tools. And we seem to know that what needs to happen right now is what's known as a spiritual revolution. Because as we just read with Orwell, every way we've been doing this throughout history has just created the same thing over and over and over again. So what are we going to do differently this time? But what happened is that we disengaged from politics. We disengaged from our social responsibility. We got affluent, we got middle class, and we took our privilege cards and we cashed them in. We decided it wasn't time to go out and work. It wasn't time to go out and organize. It wasn't time to sacrifice for anything. Instead, I'm just going to work on myself. Right? And that resulted in lost revolutionary potential for the entire movement and an abiding culture of narcissism, which has taken over most of the psychedelic community. You guys haven't worked with me before. I do this all the time. I like to roast sacred cows into hamburger. It's kind of like what I do, so don't anybody get offended. Okay, so now there are people who argue, and I can't say I know this one way or the other. I've seen a lot of documentation, a lot of evidence. There's some people that argue that this was intentional. That the New Age movement and all that LSD was dumped on the radical subculture in 1968 to turn them into a bunch of idiots. And to stop them from actually rebelling, which was going on all around the world in 1968, cities all over, student rebellions, except we had something going on here in 1968. And within 2 years, that was pretty much gone. And the hippie arrived, you know. It's for real. So, this is something to consider. Is everything you believe in or hold sacred right now actually just a construct to make you ineffective and inept as a political force? Consider it. What was the result of the consciousness revolution? It was a 50-year counteraction called the War on Consciousness or the War on Drugs. 50 years of repressive policies, criminalization of the revolution of consciousness, a de facto religious war. And what do I mean by religious war? Carol Moore puts it this way. A prime hidden agenda in the war on drugs remains the suppression of an alternate religious view. That consciousness is the nature and purpose of reality, that humans freely create their realities. Because psychoactive drugs are a means of quickly and effectively initiating individuals into this view, they must be suppressed, even if it means punishment, incarceration, and death for hundreds of thousands of people, but such is the nature of all religious wars. Carol Moore. Okay, so why does this matter now? Well, forgiving most of America, who has this thing called normalcy bias, which means that they don't understand that because things have always been this way, they're always going to be a certain way, because we've had a whole generation without a major depression and a major war and much of the social calamities that most societies go through on a regular recurring basis. We don't believe anything's going to happen. There's a book called The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. One of the most fascinating books I've ever read in my life. And it's dense, but I'm going to break down the nut of what really matters in here. These two guys parsed out a regular 80-year recurring cycle in history they call a saeculum. It only occurs in Anglo-American history. There's something specific to this culture that we have, that every 80 years, there's a recurring cycle of crisis and awakening. It's about the length of one human lifespan. and it goes back to the 1500s. It's broken into 4 phases. There's a high, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis. The high is obviously the high point of the society where everybody's kind of on board with morals, values, ethics, and practices and institutions. The awakening is when they start to question those values, institutions, and practices and ethics. Ultimately, that brings on a rebellion. The society splits. It starts to unravel, factioning into different groups, which eventually leads us into a crisis. And the crisis is when all of these problems and all of this opposition and all of this division comes head to head. Without fail, at the end of every one of these cycles, going back to the 1500s, there's been a major economic collapse and a major war. The last one was the Great Depression, World War II. Before that was Civil War. Actually, to be specific, the Great War period goes from World War I through World War II. So there was a really extended period of global warfare, global economic collapse. Civil War was 80 years before that. Revolutionary War was 80 years before that, and so on and so forth. So right now, the Anglo-American experiment, specifically the United States, is stuck in the crisis phase, right in the middle of it. I'm sorry, that's supposed to read 2025. That's a typo. I told you this is my first PowerPoint, so thanks for giving me a little break here. Okay, so all these crisis phases end in war and economic collapse. We are in a crisis phase, and we are like halfway through it. Which means that if you notice what's going on out there in the markets, if you look at what's going on with Syria, with military maneuverings in the South China Sea, everybody is starting to test the borders of what's pliable as far as military power, economic power. People are challenging the dollar. People are challenging OPEC. Everything's starting to come apart. We have revolutions going on all over this world except the United States. They're asleep. And they're asleep because they had this little skip in the cycle. And so they don't see that this is going to happen. Whereas my grandparents' generation, they saw this. My grandfather's been talking about this because he lived through it. It's just a real simple thing. The baby boomers skipped all of this, and they still don't think that this is going to happen. They somehow think that we are exceptional, that we're not going to go into like full-on economic collapse and war over this. What has changed that would prevent it, I ask you today. So, what this really means in the end is, how you gonna act, kid? How will this community respond to the next major crisis phase? What role should it play? What will it take to get this movement politically organized and active again? What will it take for the scientists to feel like they don't have to disown or disavow the culture in order to be thought of as respectable? When is it that we can get our funding and not consider our culture or our politics a liability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But really, if we've spent 50 years evolving with psychedelic compounds, and we're supposed to be more conscious, we're supposed to be spiritually evolved, we're supposed to have learned all of the lessons from the previous generation, why aren't we doing anything about it? And I see a lot of glum faces looking at me right now.
It's the heat.
And you know, I'm not like here to blow smoke up your ass. That's not my job. My job is to challenge you. My job is to make you think. Maybe you can get angry, but at least feel something and think something about this. We had the MAPS conference in April in Oakland. And because of the personal politics of the keynote speaker, something like this was not welcome. Discussion about the culture, visionary art, dance, the freaks, and the geeks were not welcome. It was just about the science, because everything else is a liability. So how do we get to be a liability? And what does that mean when people say, well, you know what, we're sitting here in this conference together, but when it comes down to the rubber hitting the road, I don't really want to know you because you're going to jeopardize my credibility and my funding. That's a serious question that we need to address. We have to somehow rectify and reunite the science and the spiritual parts of this movement. You know, who knows about the what to believe, right? What to belief's all about. Can science and spirituality coexist? Well, this is probably the first and best place to test that theory out. I mean, at least we're like getting together and talking. At least we're, you know, pushing some aspect of the movement. But there's a lot of stuff going on out there, and we're not really having any presence there at all. But a generation ago, we were the presence. Okay, what happened in between? You know? What's interesting is that the baby boomers had a lot of kids. There's 80 million of them in the United States. It's the largest single generation in American history. Their parents were before that. I don't know how many of this generation there are in England, but if anybody can hit me to those stats, we can add that to the top. But we're looking at roughly what, 100 million people? And that's a lot of young people without jobs, moving back home, living with their parents because there's no economic progress happening, there's no opportunities, there's no long-term security, their parents' pensions are disappearing. They're ending up having to work into their 70s, like my father, who works as a TSA baggage screener at 75 years old and can't retire and won't be able to retire. They said that the movement burnt out. This is the theory. They said it burnt out after Nixon. They put all the effort into it that they could, and when he was gone, they figured they'd won. And so they just decided to check out for a while, into disco, really. And then like the movement kind of regrouped and it went underground. It went into what was known as the human potential movement. And that's where all this new age stuff came from. And this is where most of what we consider to be like the canon of ethics and beliefs and morals of this culture came from, you know, Esalen and all of that. And they figured, okay, if we just take people and we make them the best possible people and they have a personal spiritual revolution, that they will, by virtue of who they are, go out into the world and make it a better place. Okay. Man, I know people who've been doing that work for 50 years. And they're still doing that work. But they didn't actually step outside of it. They didn't go anywhere. They didn't take it anywhere. It's just about, I'm still working on myself. I know I'm 70 and I've been doing it for 30 years, but I'm still working on myself. And so, like, where is the elder mentorship that we've talked about? How come, you know, we said we didn't have any elders in the 60s revolution, right? So that's why, you know, it was an impetuous, childish revolution. That's why we didn't get anywhere with it. Okay, well, now we have the elders, and a bunch of them are sitting around here right now. Why aren't they sitting down with the young people right now and saying, hey, guess what? This is serious right now. This isn't a joke. I mean, just by a show of hands, just, you know, for shits and giggles, who here thinks I'm like totally paranoid about this? And one person? You think I'm paranoid? All right. Good. Well, I mean, that's good to know. It's also why I'm wearing this thing, because I love England, because it's a cheap applause, I know, but everybody loves how Europeans understand their politics. They're literate people, they're smart, all right? And it's great to come over here and talk, and be able to have this discussion. In the United States, this does not take place, trust me, in any way, shape, or form. And it really vexes me, to use a very specific word, you know? I feel very vexed by this. Because I've been a political organizer. I was an official with the Green Party for 3 years, organizing demonstrations and radical actions. I went out there and I feel like I paid my dues. You know, I got my head cracked open enough times to realize that's not the way to do it. And the thing was, there was only about like a handful of us doing that. And when the handful of us left, there wasn't anybody really doing it anymore. And I'm not saying they should be doing it, but it was just that it had gotten so narrow in its appeal to people that it was easily marginalized as fringe. I mean, we had 10 million people show up for one march to stop the Iraq War, and that was kind of about it. And I remember specifically people saying things like, gosh, it was just like the 60s again. We got to sing folk songs and march around and express our anger. And it was like, protest has become theater now. You know, it's become entertainment. Oh, hey, let's go down to the protest. And then so slowly our rights erode. Slowly our wealth evaporates. And rapidly we get rammed into a surveillance military police state. Like we have both here in the most video monitored city on earth and back in the United States, which is basically a gigantic prison right now that you cannot get into and you can't really get out. And it's only beginning, trust me. When the dollar is no longer the dollar, things over there will be so untenuous, I'm not sure what we're going to do. Because unlike England, the United States doesn't have a fraction of the level of consciousness about its own present situation. There is so much propaganda, so much deceit, so much mendicant begging in Congress from lobbyists and corporations that the whole system has been completely corrupted. And I defy anybody out there to challenge me on it and show me one example where it hasn't been. Because it's a systemic illness. And the only way that it changes is if it goes away.
What about Occupy in America? Occupy movement.
What do you think Occupy accomplished? What did it accomplish?
Well, it was brutally suppressed in Oakland, which is the main part where it was actually rising and becoming very dominant. It was brutally suppressed. It doesn't mean the consciousness wasn't there. It was there.
Well, I was down there a little bit. What I saw was the typical thing that you always see at a demonstration, which is a bunch of leftists screaming at each other and arguing. And they spend most of their day screaming at each other and arguing about who's right about this little tenet of socialism, or whether Grover Norquist really is a free marketer, or who's, you know, whether Bush or Cheney's the true evil, or who cares? And what ended up happening with Occupy is only one thing. It was the single largest domestic intelligence gathering operation since the Vietnam War.
So then what we're supposed to do? Because that was at least one big effort to try and make a change. So, and you're saying that didn't work, so what do we do? You know, really?
What makes you think I know what we're supposed to do individually? Like, I know a bunch of different little things I think we can do and we should do. But guess what? You know, the first thing is that we have to acknowledge that first step to getting better is to acknowledge that you have a problem. We have to admit that we have the problem first. We have to admit that we checked out many, many years ago and never checked back in.
Yeah.
Thank you. One last thing. That's my sister. Her name's Saraya. 5 days ago, she committed suicide. She spent 40 years battling addiction and alcoholism. When she was at the end of her rope and I told her that plant medicine would help her in a way that all of this other stuff she had tried before wouldn't, she wouldn't take it, because the people in AA said that that was using a drug and that it would make her sick. And the stigma attached to psychedelics and psychedelic medicine was so great that she didn't want to be associated with it. She didn't believe in it. And I know many of you may think it's tacky to do this, but it's not when you have written an entire book about your 12-year crack addiction and what you did to get out of it, and then you watch your own sister go down the same path when you know better, and you have the solution right there in your hands, and they're too afraid to take it from you because they think it's wrong. They think it's bad, and it might make them crazy if they take it. But they're already crazy, and they don't see it, you know? So what's it going to take so that we can stop this kind of thing from happening? Because this is one story of millions of people that cannot find the healing that they're looking for because we're not going out there and demanding that it's our right to have this healing.